I'm Dane, and before deciding whether or not to spend time, money, taking a risk to connect in a meaningful way, to perhaps join me at the Medicina Eco Village in Costa Rica, you have a right to know who you're dealing with. I was christened Dane Easter Colby and born on a Louisiana kitchen table on January 4th, 1975. My first memories were growing up in upstate New York and attending the Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School, as well as trying to get through the biodynamic farm fields on the way to school without being trampled by the local bull. From there, moving with my family, moved to Sussex, England, briefly attending the Michael Hall Waldorf School, moving to Cyprus in a kind of romantic experiment led by my mother, then to Findhorn, Scotland, the spiritual community founded by the Caddies in, I believe, the 70s. From there to Missouri, briefly attending the Waldorf School in Vancouver, Canada, and from thence heading out on my own, starting my landscape business, my only source of employment for the entirety of my adult life in West Vancouver, moving that to Whidbey Island, Washington, learning about design, installation, and I've been the founder, owner, designer, and foreman of Mystical Landscapes, now based in Marin, California. As I'm making this video, it's 2023, which I've run and operated for the past, I think, 31 years. Now, what seems relevant? What I want to touch on is what I consider some of the risks and some of the benefits, but I also understand that I look at risks and benefits different than the average person. And so I want to touch on some of the risks and rewards, risks and benefits that as they might be seen from, a more traditional perspective. Now, perhaps the single biggest risk, and let's start with the downside, is that anytime you step outside of the norm, off the beaten trail, it is the unknown. Now, this captivates the amygdala, the whole matrix of the oldest brain, the reptilian brain, with its fight, flight, and freeze protocol, is designed to protect us from dying. And the broadest sweep of that protection is to avoid the unknown. This is a rational decision because 99.9% of reality lies in the unknown and in the unknown. And so if you just do what you've always done in the way that you've always done it, with the people you've done it with, in the place you've always done it, you're going to get predictable results, mediocre results, often painful and uncomfortable results, but predictable results. And predictability preserves energy. You do not have to figure out a new way of handling what's been going on for generations, for hundreds of years. You don't have to learn how to think in order to deal with the known in a familiar way. But as soon as you step outside the circle, the familiar, you have a number of crises. You have to learn how to evaluate the difference between the unknown that is taking you in a horrific, terrifying, and destructive direction, and the unknown that is taking you in a direction that is 10 times better than the familiar, than the status quo. And there's no one that can make that decision other than you. Because even if you trust someone, you've got to be smart enough to know who to trust. And you're not normally smart enough to do that unless you are smart enough to tell the difference between the luminous unknown and the destructive unknown. And in many cases, it's also understanding what part of the cycle that you're on. The most fundamental building blocks of reality are circles or cycles of energy in different forms and in different time spans. You have millisecond cycles. You have other cycles that take place every 100 million years, every billion years. We haven't seen the trillion-year cycles yet in our universe, but they're out there as well. And if you're part of a cycle that happens every minute, breathing, if you're part of a cycle that happens every year, right, summer and spring, if you're part of a cycle that happens every 5 to 7 years, a recession and a boom, right, in the economy, if you're part of something, part of a cycle that happens every 1 to 300 years, the rise and fall of a prevailing order of an empire, well, you know, it's disorienting to find that, you know, there's about to be a sea change in a cycle that happens every 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 years. And, well, we just weren't around to see where we were on those cycles. And part of that exists in a human lifespan. People go up, people come down. Maybe they reintegrate, reformulate, and then they go up stronger after coming down. In the entrepreneurial cycles, many seasoned investors like to see someone who's failed 2 or 3 times, right, and learned from those failures. And the next one becomes the unicorn, right, the one that ultimately is valued at more than $1 billion. So, you know, the truth is that most of reality is far bigger than we can put into language, for the simple reason that words are so slow, right? The process of speaking is so slow that by the time you've put many cycles into words, they've already happened. Right? You can describe the cycle of an inhale and an exhaling breath for an hour, right? It's just long past, right? And the cycles of microorganisms and subatomic particles are so fast relative to language that we could spend 1 trillion years trying to describe the movements of a single molecule in a single finger, and we wouldn't catch up, right? We wouldn't catch up, right? Because every subatomic particle in that molecule is moving faster than we can say the word molecule. And so we're far behind. Just as the universe expands and we see light that's 1 billion years old, right? We get the message 1 billion years too late that something went on here. And we talk about being in the present moment. Well, you get the idea. It's going to take a lot of time. It's disorienting to step into the unknown. You can't control it very well because you don't know what's there, right? And so, right, that is a risk. And the amygdala of every reptilian brain is saying, don't step out of the circle. Don't begin the hero's journey into the unknown. Some may die, they do. Some may fail, they do. Some may lose everything, they do. And some will slay the dragon, will face the fear of death, and come back, bringing gifts from the unknown, treasures. Everything we value today is another person's hero's journey, right? Edison, Tesla, Marconi, the inventor of, the discoverer of radio frequencies, right? Wi-Fi, right? Everything we have today, the people that developed screens, computers, paint, right? A sawmill, architecture, right? Everything we have around us, our clothes, our adornments, the way we've styled our hair, is built on the foundation of heroes, people who have stepped out of what was then the norm, ventured into the unknown, made sure that it was safe for the rest of us, brought the gifts back, some going bankrupt, some dying, some losing their marriage, some losing their mind, but others returning and bringing the gifts to the cult, to the norm, to the status quo, to become the new norm, the new dogma. This is how we do things because we do things because that's why we do things. So it is a risk, right? It's a risk to know someone unusual. It's a risk to do things in unusual ways. And Medicina is a great risk. Why? Well, it's an unknown country, in an unknown recipe, with an unknown group of people, right? It's a big risk. It's a journey into the unknown. And what you and I have to figure out is where on the bell curve is it likely to land? Because every innovation has a bell curve of adoption, but also a bell curve of competency and excellence. Right back here, right, you have people still driving around in horse and buggy. Up here, you have the latest jet packs, right? People with compact, highly condensed batteries able to individually take off and GPS propel themselves to a location without any traffic, right? The pioneers, some of whom will die, right? Some of whom will discover things they didn't know, right? But the majority hangs out in the midground, right? They're no longer using horses and carts. They're quite happy not to discover the jetpacks. Well, there's the direction of innovation. Are you going backwards or forward? And then there's the adoption cycle. So if you're interested in Medicina at this stage, you're definitely an early adopter, right? Willing to take risks and imperfections in order to try something that's never been done before. And the statistics are not good. Number one, 95% of this type of, I would call it, birthing a culture, perhaps a microculture, cultures of 100 people. 95% of them do not get out off the ground, right? They're conversations in a million heads across the planet that never go anywhere. So that's the first statistic. And those that do, right, 95% of them fail to live up to the upper edge of the dominant culture. It's not that hard if you are willing to make a moderate amount of income and live a comfortable lifestyle and retire in what would be the luxury of queens just a few thousand years ago. Right? They didn't have TVs. They didn't have millions of media packets to download and explore. They didn't have Wikipedia, right? So it's not too hard to retire into the medium to upper, echelon of our culture and do okay, right? Do okay. And so there's a big statistical likelihood, if you were rolling a dice, of not getting to that point in something new. Now, when you think of 10x thinking, 10x living, the other thing that's, you can look at this in the innovation cycle, and we're still playing this down. Now, obviously, I've invested and am investing more in this than I've done anything else in my life. More of my time, more of my thought, more of my money is going into Medicina than to any other thing that I've done in my entire life, of the thousands of goals that, So obviously, I think that we're going to overcome these odds. But the question is, do you? Because you're going to play a critical role in that, right? And so it's important to know the odds, right? Because if you're playing a game of musical chairs and there's 100 people and there's only 5 chairs, that means that 95 people are going to be out of the game. And the question is, are you going to be one of the 5? Now, in the musical chairs games, I wouldn't play the odds, right? You're just walking around the circle, right? But when you're looking, and in Vegas, right, I wouldn't play the odds, right? The rules have been defined, right? So the question is, can we create a pattern of doing things? Can we create a pattern of doing things that beat those odds? Well, one of the things that, I would say that 75% of that risk lies with me, right? I'm the biggest investor, the biggest designer. I've got many of the competencies in the arena, right? So as someone who has designed and built houses as a general contractor, as someone who has designed and developed land, right, as a land developer, as someone who has designed and built landscapes as a landscape designer and installer, certainly on an architectural and structural engineering and aesthetic level, I have most of the competency in that area, right? And that competency is based on being able the assumed competency is based on the ability to take things that I've done in Canada, things that I've done on Whidbey Island in Washington, things that I've done in Marin County, California, and move those to Costa Rica, right? So slightly different weather, slightly different habitat, different dynamics, different building codes, some materials available, not available, labor pools being different, right? So there's movement of those competencies. But I'm also drawing on successful experiences at the Findhorn community in Scotland, where I spent 6 months in my teens, fascinated by the power structure there. And then mediocre experiences in the Hawthorne Valley and also the Hostley Hill community that's kind of built in support of parents of the Michael Hall Waldorf School. The corruption and power dynamics at multiple Waldorf schools, functional and dysfunctional. It has to, it relies on my competency in developing a self-styled homeschool program, right? I went into school, out of school. My third grade teacher died. Then I did tutoring. Then I did public school. Then I did public school again. Then Waldorf school. Then Findhorn. Then Cypress, right? Then self-designed homeschool program, right? Then Vancouver High School, then self-designed homeschooling program again. So vacillating back and forth, seeing the pros and cons of different approaches, I ultimately settled on the fact that 80% of what I was learning in school was not preparing me for the life that I wanted to live. That the 20% that was being taught 50% inefficiently in a group format rather than one-on-one mentors. And I presented my thoughts to all of my teachers and parents. Everyone disagreed with me. None of them was willing to discuss the pros and cons. They simply disagreed, as in this is not the way things were done. And this is a formative moment in my life because as a 14-year-old teenager who's depressed, suicidally depressed, who's not sure exactly how everything fits together, but who is sure there's a tremendous amount of waste going on in my school, has to listen to, a cohesive group around me. Mom, Dad, all my teachers in the Waldorf school, all saying it's a bad idea to design your own homeschool program. And yet none of them could articulate good reasons why. A few of them said that you won't be able to get into college if you don't graduate high school. A couple of them said you wouldn't get a job if you couldn't show that you graduated. But none of them actually said that, what you're learning is useful for the life that you want to live, right? So the frame was different, right? And the reason that I chose to design my homeschool program was this. I said none of these people are thinking very clearly. You have to think clearly before you can articulate clearly. They weren't thinking clearly, so they couldn't articulate clearly. They couldn't make a compelling case for the way that hundreds of millions of people were doing things and had been doing things for a while, right? But I could make a very compelling case about the fact that there was clearly a better way. Now, what would be a better way than high school? Well, my parents, I think, were paying some thousands of dollars a year for my private schooling, all right? So if I stopped going, well, they would save thousands of dollars. Right? Well, that's a benefit, obviously, right off the bat. But if I wasn't bogged down by the minutia of homework and, the standard curriculum, I could study things that were actually useful, including, how about, for a start, how to respond to depression. Something that, strangely, in a culture that produces 20% depression in its population. I don't know if you know that, but 20% of Americans are depressed. Well, it seems to me that that's a pretty useful thing to understand and learn, as an example, right? But there's no time to learn it privately because your time is taken up with all of these useless classes and then all of the homework for all the useless classes and then driving to and from school, right? So, right? It's obvious that's a big one to start dealing with, right? People commit suicide in this country because they don't know how to deal with depression. Maybe we could teach a few things, right? Maybe 1 hour a week would be worth, improving the well-being, right? So, but there's no time to think. There's no time to think when everyone's going through rote dogma. It's taking up all of their time. And so I left high school, and it's one of the best decisions that I've made. I did it under protest of every single grown-up around me, right? And it worked better than I would have thought, and better than all of them thought, by a factor of 10. And so when you have that experience at a young age, you discover something incredible. Sometimes when you're the only one saying something, and everyone's saying it's a bad idea, sometimes that means you're onto something, right? Now you've got to figure out, are you nuts or do you see something that nobody else sees? You've got to figure that out. Now, the way I figured it out as a teenager, because it was my life, right? I was going to suffer if I was wrong. I was going to benefit if I was right. As a teenager, right, the way that I made the discernment was that none of the people I'm talking to are thinking as clearly as I am. And that the path that is likely to lead to more well-being is better thought through. So I'm the best thinker. And that also registered for me because I said, they've all learned to think going to school, or learn not to think going to school. And so obviously it hasn't taught them the single most important skill, which is to think and articulate. Well, do I want to end up like them? And it makes sense to me that if you do dumb things that you perceive to be dumb, just because other people are doing them, that's the antithesis of thinking, right? So you actually can learn to numb and dumb rather than to think and explore. So that trajectory then freed up my most important resource, time, to ask one question. What skills are most likely to be useful for humanity over the next 100 years? Right? That's roughly a human lifespan, give or take. So what skills does the world need? Not what is it going to pay the most for, because the world is often backwards, but what does it need, right? So I sat down and I spent time designing my curriculum in response to that question. Sustainable ecology. Effective communication. Part of that, sales. Business, economics, right? Grounded imagination. Health, right? Pretty basic, right? Health. Learning to cook good, healthy, organic food. Right? Grounded imagination, the most important of all skills that leads to Medicina. Medicina is not possible without grounded imagination, right? I had the image before I had the country. I had the image, and then I traveled the world and settled on Costa Rica. And then I traveled Costa Rica and settled on Guanacaste, and traveled Guanacaste and settled on Medicina, right? The most compatible place that I know of in the world for this design, right? You have an imagination, but you've got to ground it to reality. Nothing is perfect. You've got to get something workable, right? And so many things at this stage of Medicina are still design, right? The people are a design, and they have to be grounded to people like you, right? You're not perfect. I'm not perfect for Medicina. But it has to be good enough. It has to be the best that is available for the design to work. Right? So that's being filtered down, right? Now, this is also part of a design. Right? You've got to see what's possible, and you've got to see where it can go wrong. Right? You've got to see what's good and what's bad. You've got to see the things, the risks, as well as the opportunity. You've got to mitigate those, and also you've got to decide if you can work with them. I fire clients from time to time because although it's possible to work with them, I know that I will be in an emotional knot of frustration to a degree that is just not necessary, right? Yes, you've got your $100,000 and you'd like to hire me, but I've got $100,000 in other places where I won't be tied up in a knot, right? Colluding with one part of a marital spat or, helping you play out your power dynamics. You need to do that, but I don't need to do them with you. So that beginning, the realization that the focus should be on the quality of thought, on the quality of the design, that grounded imagination was the most important skill, but then you need practical things, right? It's the grounded imagination. What that means is that, the structures that I have in my mind, I've built them in my mind. But I've also built each of the techniques, in my 30 years of, home and mostly landscape and site development. I operate the heavy machinery and understand and looked at the site and the land before buying it, knowing how I would do different things, checking on what was and wasn't available. Right? So it's grounded imagination. Right? And at my time at Findhorn, right? At my time in various retreat centers, during my time traveling the world and noticing the tremendous amount of waste in social interactions, right? You have 100 people that don't know each other sleeping in beds room by room by room without catalyzing the synergistic possibility between those groups. That is an incredible missed opportunity, right? And I've watched those. I've gone over that 1,000 times in my traveling days. The missed opportunity, the missed opportunity. And what good design is in all fields is you take a certain number of variables, time, money, natural resources, people, and you know that you can configure them in a million different ways. And what good design does is it generates more sustainable value at lower cost with less waste than another design. Right? The best design is the best pattern you can come up with for configuring those resources to create the most amount of sustainable well-being. That's the best design. Now, Medicina is, a tribute to good design. Right? And the most challenging thing to locate is people that want to think, that want to participate, that want to evaluate in transcending the cult of their norm and become part of something new, right? Now, this is the most important territory of this kind of exploration of where I'm going. But it is useful. It is useful to ground, to acknowledge failures and risks along the way. So let's do a little bit of that right now. This is a good website, daneeasterrose.com, to go into this more deeply, right? This represents the past. Now, the past is good for benchmarks and raw ingredients, meaning the future is being built out of the raw ingredients generated in the past. So, you know, and this website in and of itself is a little bit of a design, right? We have two parts, our outer side, our inner side, our more feminine side, the light side, the more shadowy side, right? So we have, you know, different sides of our brain. So the site is broken down on that. I'll just kind of touch a little bit on, you know, how this weaves into Medicina, right? One of the prompts for Medicina was this project that I did on homelessness in my town. Why is it that in the 5th wealthiest county in the United States, I see more homelessness than I see in Thailand? It's a good question, right? So, you know, diving into that, I discovered that if you look at that graph kind of at the top, I'm kind of in the way there. If you look at that graph, you can see the red graph is the rate at which housing prices have increased for a variety of reasons. And the green is the average income increase. Now, you know that if that graph continues, that there will be more and more homelessness. So you can see that we've created that graph through more than 1,000 local laws, et cetera, et cetera. But the average house in my county of Marin is $1.2 million today, right? And of course, you know, 2/3 of the population cannot afford that house. And so realizing that local politics blocked, meaning it made it so inefficient to do anything about that, I decided to create housing for 100 people. And so the goal is, well, if one house, the average costs $1.2 million, and it's illegal to build a cheaper house, without going into all the details here, there are more than 1,000 laws and codes that make it illegal to build a house for less than $700,000 in Marin today, right? Well, what if you could house 100 people for that same price, right? But do it somewhere else, right? And then show how it's done, right? So that's a little seed. Like these are things from the past. You know, this project here on human states. You know, everyone has a state of mind, a state of being, but it is evoked by the ecology, by the surrounding. The mental ecology, the emotional ecology, and the social and physical ecology, right? And the question is, how do you create an ecology that evokes the best of human states, right? And that's a good question to ask. You know, a little sideline on Asperger's syndrome, right? We have labels for kind of connotating traits that are predominant, right? Because engineering works, if you love people, you want things to work, I would guess is a good starting point. And if you want things to work, you want to use the practices that are most likely to work. And those are engineering practices. You look at statistics, right? If you're really cruel, you send your friend to Vegas with $10,000 to get rich. And you wish them luck. Oh, I'm rooting for you. You know, if you're really cruel, you have remained dumb about the 98% chance that your friend has of coming back with nothing, right? You haven't cared enough about yourself and them to learn that. And so you send them off to Vegas with lots of good luck. If you're really kind, you tell your friend to make a down payment on a house or invest in a good library of books and start reading them, to improve their well-being, right? And so this engineering trait, focusing on statistics, focusing on what works, leads to the constant comment coming towards me, you're different. You're always thinking in abstract and statistical terms. Well, people with Asperger's have that tendency. And it's a useful thing that in my past I've leaned on to be able to have a conversation about why and what the differences are. So if we look at how do you develop a good design sense, right? In a world where most of the time nobody's asking what's a good 10x design, right? Well, I created this, I got frustrated with the lack of a place to put love in the form of ideas that benefit people's lives. So I created this channel, Ideas Worth Action, and anytime I have an idea that I don't see being implemented, I think would be great, well, I just publish it online. I don't have enough bodies to do even 1% of all my ideas, but I still like to put them out. Now, this helps me let go of it, but even if only 5 people act on even 5 of my ideas sometime in the next 50 years that these videos are up, and the world becomes better for 1,000 people, it's worth my time to put them up. So that's a design decision to generally lean towards putting stuff out there, however imperfect, knowing that other people can criticize it and make it better, right? We have to start somewhere. Success courses for landscapers. I'm just kind of giving you a little bit of an overview of who I am because, well, you're going to be dealing with me if you live at Medicina in a major way. So success courses for landscapers. I'm one of the 1% of 35,000 landscape operators in the United States that works 2 to 3 hours a day and donates most of my time to nonprofit, gets 90% of my jobs done early rather than late, gets all of my jobs done on budget rather than cost overruns, and that's able to take off at least 5 months of the year and run a successful business, right? So less than 1% of companies can do that, but they'd all like to be able to do that, right? Wouldn't it be nice to have that competency? So I created a course for other landscapers. Co-Creating Conscious Chemistry is a book that I wrote that's one of the most technical books, but it just goes into 50 variables in relationship chemistry and 30 paradigms within which to engage relationships. And I think, that's one of the most important and understudied sciences. 101 Choices on My Path to Well-Being. This is a book. And there's a lot of stuff that goes into the design of these, meaning most of the creative projects that I do are to help me improve my thinking, and then why not share it with the world? And so, I've self-published the books strategically so that I can spend more time, creating actual things in my life, because being a traditionally published author and doing the whole speaking tours and all that, takes a lot of time and expense relative to, just modest publishing, but careful development of thinking. And so one of the things that I look at when I do a project is, will I have more skill on the other side of doing it, right? And that's definitely the case with Medicina. If I fail to be in the top 5% of successful creations in terms of it all working out as intended for all involved, will you be a better person? Will you know more? Will you be more competent on the other side of that failure, right? That's because that is the real success, right? And so that's part of my thinking. Can I win while losing, right? Even better, can I win while winning, right? That's great, right? And in different areas, like in landscapes, I win while winning 90% of the time. 90% of what I do works out the way, and it's always expanding, right? But 10% of what I do doesn't work the first time. So I iterate and iterate until it works, right? Because it's such a big field that in any given year, after 30 years of doing this, there are still 20% of the opportunities that are given to me that no one ever explained to me, I've never run into, I can't find someone who knows more than me in that area. And so we got to take our best shot at it. And then, as I say, 90% of the time that works. 10% of the time we have to iterate until it works, right? And and that's loving reality until it gets better. I had a horrific psychedelic experience facilitated by an incompetent therapist, shaman, etc., who ended up precipitating massive amounts of PTSD, tremendous pain, grief, etc. Just by far the worst experience of my adult life was paid for to a supposed therapist around psychedelics. Now, this gave rise to a need. In my state of disintegration, trauma, PTSD, I realized that I didn't know how to help myself. I also realized, since it was my therapist that was responsible for the first wave of abuse, and his colleagues at the Human Awareness Institute that were responsible for escalating it, right? It's a very difficult thing to be in massive amounts of pain and realize that you don't know enough to trust people competently, and they don't know what they're doing, right? Nobody tries to ruin their clients' lives. It's not good for business or well-being. And so the first thing I did was study around 1,000 hours of what could go wrong that, unfortunately, I didn't study before my first psychedelic experience. Studying all that could go wrong, looking at bad practices and best practices. This also led me to all that could go right if you had the most competent setting and space, and I began looking for that. That doesn't exist in a structured sense in the world, an optimum place to have optimum psychedelic experiences, in part because they're built on these little containers of weekends and weeks that if things go wrong, it takes months to deal with it, but the little container is over. So you're a remainder. You're part of the 10% for whom horrible things happen, and, well, you just have to deal with them on your own. I wanted to create a place where people could have months of container, to deal with that. So that was actually one of the initial drivers for Medicina, the medicine, a place of integration and healing that would not have a time limit, right? Now, I spent $70,000 ineptly recovering from psychedelic trauma and therapeutic abuse. Now, that trauma and my awareness of how expensive it was to largely fail at dealing with it led me to redesign what good trauma treatment and care looks like, right? And unfortunately, we are a very retroactive, reactive culture when it comes to healing. So the person who's in massive amounts of trauma would do anything to stop it, of course. But you ask their neighbor who hasn't yet experienced it, would you like to preempt it and learn about it? And they'd rather watch TV, right? So it's not a very intelligent culture in that sense. But in developing a competent recipe for healing severe trauma and abuse, one of the interesting parallels that I noticed was that if I was to create the perfect environment for healing traumatic abuse and mental emotional trauma, it would also be the most enjoyable place to live. The very things that help you prevent trauma, heal trauma, integrate, grow from trauma, those things are the very things that make for a rich and fulfilling life. And so because we're more of a positive-looking culture, we like to think of the bright, shiny stuff. We don't like to look at the shadow. We don't like to look at death. We don't like to look at the horrors of the traumatic underbelly of our cult, and we usually hide and bury apologize for being in a horrific state when we show up in our cult, right? So, just working with that a little bit, focusing on 10x living. 10x living definitely includes traumatic recovery, and when I discovered what worked and all the things I didn't know that I didn't know, part of my way of learning that is always to speak them. And if I'm going to speak and write them, why not share them freely for all? And so part of a nonprofit project is just to volunteer my time to share things that could solve, that would help people avoid massive amounts of pain. So that, Medicina is an answer to that. It's not the forefront initially, right? Because you can't build a culture with 100 highly traumatized people in desperate states of self-centeredness to manage their pain, right? You have to build a group of healthy individuals that are trauma literate, and then you can help 5 people at a time, right? To move through that, to transcend that, and to go back into the world 10 times faster, 10 times more productively, right? So that's a huge return on investment. I also, most of my life has been kind of forward, goal-oriented. I've achieved thousands of goals, but learning to protest when I couldn't function, right? And when the power structures around me, were lined up, making it worse to protect their survival structures, it was very counterintuitive, very awkward, but there was a role of learning to protest. And so, I started becoming a critic and a protester for the things I couldn't deal with at the time. And the role that this plays in Medicina and in my life today is, for example, I'm married to someone who had severe shame and PTSD when I met her. And I was so upset at the time because I was going through mine. And I was so upset that I couldn't find a single competent adult to love me when I didn't know how to love myself, and teach me how to love myself and create an environment for my healing. And so I thought, well, rather than just bitch about that, why don't I be that for her? Why don't I be the adult that I'm furious doesn't exist for me, and see if it works? Because this is a hypothesis, meaning I think that I would be doing much better if I had a single adult doing this, but no one's ever done it, so I can't be sure. So I decided to be that adult for her. And we've just completed it's actually our 5th anniversary today. And that hypothesis right? Of criticizing and breaking down what's wrong so that you can do what's right once you figure that out. That's a very important part of moving from the adolescent state of critique and rebellion to the adult state of creation and service, right? And we have to go through the adolescent stage to get to the adult stage. So this is my adolescence, and it has played a very big role in understanding the many landmines in power abuses, and the like. Creating this website is also a little bit of an answer to the void. So many people are unknown unknowns. I talk to married couples around the country, and I ask the wife 3 questions about her husband, and I ask the husband 3 questions about the wife, and they cannot answer 50% of the time. And then I have the other one answer the question and answer the question. And so their intimacy in those areas raises by 100% from half to doubling. It goes up 100% in 10 or 15 minutes, right? And so there's this tremendous void in intimacy, tremendous void that people don't know they don't know, right? And how to respond to that. And part of my, I've done 2 experiments to kind of answer that. One is a book I wrote for friends and lovers about all the things that nobody knows about me, that nobody asks to find out what they don't know, so they don't know what they don't know. It's the unknown. And my wish is that every human being on the planet creates a user's manual. A toaster comes with one. Create a user's manual. Here's what I like. Here's what I don't like. Here's where I'm weak. Here's where I'm strong. This is a brief biography of my life. These are my dreams, right? These are my astrology data. This is my dietary preferences. These are my allergies. These are everything that's useful to know. Put it out there and let the people closest to you have a working set of effective data that's 10 times better than the average set of data. And if you improve your data set by 10 times and you're an intelligent person, you can do 10 times better in that relationship. So that's a project. And this led me to Charles Dunbar's research, which basically says that the brain is incapable of intimately knowing more than 150 people, that chimpanzees break up in their herds at around that side and become 2 different tracks because they can't empathize with people they don't understand. And they can't deeply understand more than 150 people. And so that's why the absolute cap at Medicina, at the point at which we will divide into 2 or more communities, is 150 people, right? Working with that constant theme of more intimacy equals more respect equals more flow equals more value. And the goal is not to have 1,000 friends. The goal is to have a rich and valuable relationship with the people you have in your life. We're all hypocrites, right? And so this is a little thing I made to kind of outline some of my hypocrisy, because that just comes out of, again, going through the different power structures in my life and realizing the amount of hypocrisy in government and parents and therapists and friends and all that, and how irritating it is, right? Well, my general thing is first I start outward and, bitch about it. And then once I'm really clear what I'm annoyed about, then I can say, okay, well, obviously we're all people, and so where's my hypocrisy? So I like to ultimately follow my own advice. I find that relatively few people follow my advice. I've had 4 people in my entire life that have deeply mentored with me, and their lives are exceptionally better. We're talking 300 to 500% improvements in their quality of life sustainably. Money, sex, love, etc., going up 300 to 500%. It is, of course, irritating. Like if everyone who's deeply doing that is exploding their well-being, why are so few people able to be coached, right? It's irritating. I wrote this mentoring with Dane thing just to kind of highlight that. Not a single person has applied, right? So we are a nation of know-it-alls who create massive amounts of suffering, but they know too much to, really ask for help. It's one of the reasons I like going overseas is because, my wife is Filipino, and she's one of the people whose lives has improved 500% emotionally, mentally, sexually, financially, in growth and in various things. And she's done all the work, right? My protocol is, I'll offer some support, some guidance, but you do all the work, right? So that you're resilient and independent, right? And of course, there'd be tons of people if you are offering sugar mommy, sugar daddy relationships, but that doesn't help people. It weakens them. It makes them dependent, right? And so, I want a community that's benefiting. Like, I hired the best mentors that I could find in any field and paid them whatever they wanted to be paid to learn what I've learned. That's how I started my landscape business. I found 5 mentors who were the best in the region, and I complimented them and asked to learn in a way that was convenient for them. I'll pay you what you want to be paid. I'll show up when it's good for you. I'll give you some free help, but show me how to treat my clients well, do a great job, right? That's how I learned, right? And that's how 4 people have learned from me. And yet 99.9% of the people do not even ask. It doesn't even occur to them that their life could be going up in dramatic ways, right? And so that's, some of this you have to deal with at a cultural level, right? Because we shame people for not knowing things, and we shame people for asking for help, right? And then, surprise, surprise, they don't know things, they hide that they don't know them, and they don't ask for help. So this website is also part of that expand and intimacy. And then just dealing with the fact that I didn't even know what trauma was until a stranger in a cafe gave me the first cogent definition of trauma and helped me understand that I had PTSD. None of my therapists did. And so I realized that peer-to-peer, us helping one another, is often far more effective than the pros out there. Just like good vlogging and blogging will give you more understanding about something than traditional, soundbite media, right? And so I wanted to do my part in this, project here to help understand trauma and PTSD. So I've made over 1,000 hours of video journeying from my lowest point to right now is my highest point since, the traumatic abuse, therapeutic abuse, et cetera, to see what works for me, right? And that's a good reason to live when you're in massive amounts of pain, to know that what you're doing is not just for you, it's for the planet, it's for other people. And so I started a nonprofit so that I wouldn't be taxed on my public service. I am right now the sole donor, meaning I donate half of my money to my nonprofit, then I donate most of my time. And I try and think of the question, like, what's going to have the biggest impact that I could do? What could have the biggest impact? And how can I learn in the process to be a better human being? And so that led me to this kind of project of Understand Trauma. That's also woven into, like, you can look at things on, Medicina and like if we, see if we've got it linked here, 10x community. Yeah, so one of the, these dimensions are the genetic code of Medicina, right? And they're all interwoven. And so, as I've spent the last, 10 years grappling with our dis-ease, our pain, our trauma, our loneliness, our dysfunction, our sociopathic tendencies as a culture. The designer in me says, what's a way to do it 10 times better? And so I've built these over time in a way that complement one another, that tie together. And many of these are synergistic. For example, you'll see electric, under soundscape, that there's no gas-powered motors. Well, that comes out of trying to meditate in a traumatized state and having weed eater after weed eater and blower after blower in my wealthy neighborhood disrupt my meditation and saying, I don't want anyone to have to deal with this. And so let's make it all electric, right? And at the same time, I don't want to smell gas fumes, right? And at the same time, I don't want the maintenance people to go deaf, right? And I don't want them to smell all those fumes. And so it's always about weaving things together. And so that is the arrival, right, from experiencing successful, magnificent community life at Findhorn in Scotland to mediocre community life in Hawthorne Valley and Hoathly Hill in Sussex, England, to experiencing the best and worst of what our culture has to offer, the best and worst of what other cultures have to offer. Denmark is my favorite country in Europe. Thailand is my favorite country in Asia, but everyone does something well. America makes and spends money really efficiently. And so if that were the pinnacle of existence, America would be number one. It makes and spends money more efficiently and faster than any other place that I know. It's just that anyone who's reached the point of being a consummate moneymaker and consumer understands that that's a pretty boring life, ultimately. It's not fulfilling. It does nothing to one's need for love and belonging, right? And so Medicina is in its infancy. It's in its infancy. Its most important assets are people who love, and who love enough not just to care, but who care enough to take time, who take time enough to see themselves and other people and think, who take time and care enough to move that sight into understanding, that understanding into empathy, that empathy into a response that fulfills our own need and other people's need for survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, discovering our gifts and developing them, bringing those gifts abundantly into the world, and becoming part of something greater, in service to something greater than ourselves. And that's what Medicina is for me, a prayer for something beautiful, good, and true.